Folsom State Prison towered over the small town like a gray stone monolith, reminding residents of the harsh reality of their existence. Built in 1880, it was the second oldest prison in California, and its walls had seen more human drama than any other place in the Sacramento County. For the residents of Folsom, the prison was not just a correctional facility, it was the center of economic life, an employer for hundreds of families, and a constant reminder of the fine line between law and lawlessness. Thomas Riley drove through the main gates of the prison every morning at 6:30 a.m. in his beat-up blue Ford F-150. At 42, he had been warden of Folsom for 7 years, and every day brought new challenges. His office on the 3rd floor of the administration building overlooked the courtyard where inmates spent their daily hour of fresh air. Thomas knew many of them by name, their stories, their families. It was both an advantage and a curse of his job. "Good morning, Mr. Riley," greeted his secretary, Dorothy, a middle-aged woman with gray hair pulled back in a strict bun. She had worked at the prison longer than most of the guards and knew every corner of the place. "Good morning, Dorothy. What's on the agenda today?" Thomas hung his jacket on the back of his chair and turned on his computer. "A meeting with the Board of Trustees at 10, a kitchen inspection at noon, and you have a meeting with Chaplain O'Connor at 3, plus the usual stack of reports to sign." Thomas nodded as he scanned the documents on his desk. Fight reports, medical requests, correspondence with inmates' families, an endless stream of human problems demanding his attention. Among the papers, he noticed a report on the exemplary behavior of several inmates, including Mark Velasquez. The name was familiar to him. Velasquez worked in the prison library and had never broken the rules in his 3 years of incarceration. At the same time, 4 floors below, Mark Velasquez sat at a small table in the library, sorting through the books that had just arrived. At 38, he looked older than his age. Prison life had left its mark on everyone's face. But his eyes remained lively, and his hands remained strong from regular work. "Mark, can you help with these boxes?" asked the librarian, Mr. Henson, an elderly man who treated the prisoners with a respect that was rare within these walls. "Sure," Mark replied, getting up from his seat. Physical work helped him take his mind off how long he had left to serve. 5 years. 5 more long years before he could hug his wife and son. Thoughts of his family always came unexpectedly, and brought with them a mixture of longing and guilt. Sarah wrote to him every week, but in her latest letters he sensed a growing weariness in her words. Raising 12-year-old David alone was not easy, especially when everyone at school knew that his father was in prison. 20 miles from Folsom, in a small house on Oak Street, Sarah Velasquez was making breakfast for her son before school. The kitchen was small but cozy, with yellow curtains on the windows and children's drawings on the refrigerator. Financial difficulties had forced her to sell their previous home and move to this more modest dwelling, but she tried to create a sense of normalcy for David. "Mom, when is Dad coming home?" David asked, spreading butter on his toast. The question was less frequent than it used to be, but it still cut Sarah to the quick. "In 5 years, sweetie. We've talked about this," she said, sitting down across from her son and trying to keep her voice steady. "In the meantime, we'll manage, won't we?" David nodded, but his eyes told her he understood more than his mother wanted him to. Children could be cruel at school, and being the son of a prisoner meant constantly having to prove that you weren't like your father. After David left for school, Sarah was left alone with her thoughts and a growing pile of bills on the kitchen table. Her job as a nurse at the local hospital provided a steady income, but it was barely enough to cover rent, food, and basic necessities. Visits to Mark in prison cost money for gas, which she often didn't have, adding another layer of guilt to her already complicated life. She picked up her phone and looked at Mark's photo on the lock screen. The picture had been taken a week before his arrest. She and David were in the park, and Mark was laughing at something his son had said. At the time, they had no idea that in a few days, their lives would change forever. The sound of a car in the yard interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw the old sedan belonging to her neighbor Margaret, who often helped with David when Sarah worked the night shift. "Hi, dear." Margaret came in through the back door, as close neighbors in their neighborhood usually did. "How are you? You look tired." "Everything's fine," Sarah lied, pouring coffee for both of them. Just a lot of work." Margaret knew about the situation with Mark and never judged her, but Sarah felt the weight of silent sympathy in her gaze. It was one of the most difficult aspects of her current life, the constant feeling that she was an object of pity. Meanwhile, at Folsom Prison, Father Michael O'Connor was preparing for his weekly cell rounds. At 55, he had been a prison chaplain for 12 years and had seen people find and lose hope within those walls. His gray beard and kind eyes made him a trusted figure for both inmates and staff. "Father O'Connor," greeted guard Jim Collins as he opened the door to Block D. "Velasquez asked if you could come see him today." Mark was one of the inmates Father Michael found easy to talk to. He wasn't a religious man, but he looked to the chaplain more as a counselor than a spiritual mentor. Their conversations often turned to family, remorse, and finding meaning in prison. "How are things at home?" Father Michael asked, sitting down on the only chair in Mark's cell. "Sarah writes that everything is fine, but I feel like she's hiding something," Mark said, sitting on his bunk with his hands folded in his lap. "David is growing up without a father, and I can't do anything to help from here. Families go through trials in different ways," the chaplain said gently. "It's important to stay connected and keep faith that you'll be together again." Mark nodded, but Father Michael saw growing anxiety in his eyes. Confinement affected not only the prisoners themselves, but also their families, often destroying bonds that had seemed unbreakable. By the end of the day, Thomas Riley had finished his administrative duties and was getting ready to go home. His house on Hill Street was large for one person. He had bought it when he was married, but his wife had died of cancer 5 years ago, leaving him with memories and too much space. Evenings were the hardest time. Work gave him purpose and structure, but at home the silence was deafening. He often stayed at the office longer than necessary, finding excuses not to return to his empty house. Looking through the prisoner's files, he came across Mark Velasquez's file again. The photo showed a man with honest eyes who clearly regretted his actions. The family section indicated that he had a wife, Sarah, and a son, David. Thomas knew that the families of prisoners often suffered more than the criminals themselves, especially the children. Suddenly, he felt the urge to do something to help. Maybe organize additional educational programs or improve conditions for family visits. These thoughts warmed him in his cold office as the sun set behind the prison walls, painting the sky shades of orange and red. 3 weeks had passed since Thomas Riley first noticed Mark Velasquez's file. During that time, he had begun to quietly follow the inmate's progress, noting his participation in educational programs and his exemplary behavior. When a request for additional family visitation time from Mrs. Velasquez arrived at his office, Thomas felt a strange excitement. "Mr. Riley, we have a request from the family of inmate Velasquez," Dorothy said, handing him the official form. "They are asking for an additional visit in connection with their son's birthday." Thomas took the documents, his eyes lingering on Sarah Velasquez's signature. The handwriting was neat, but he noticed a slight tremor in some of the letters, indicating nervousness or fatigue. Such requests were usually handled as standard, but something made him want to meet Mrs. Velasquez in person. "Dorothy, schedule a meeting with Mrs. Velasquez for tomorrow afternoon. I want to discuss with her personally the possibility of additional support for the families of inmates." Dorothy raised her eyebrows. The warden rarely met with inmates' families in person, especially for such routine matters. But she nodded and made a note of the meeting in her calendar. The next day, Sarah Velasquez sat nervously in the reception area of the administration building. She had put on her best dress, the dark blue one she wore for job interviews, and double-checked the documents in her purse. The meeting with the warden was unexpected. Usually, such matters were handled by social workers or junior administrators. "Mrs. Velasquez, Mr. Riley is ready to see you," Dorothy announced, pointing to the office door. Sarah entered the spacious office, where a middle-aged man with a serious but kind face sat behind a massive wooden desk. Thomas stood up to greet her, and she noticed that he was taller than he had appeared in the photos in the local newspaper. "Please have a seat," he said, pointing to a chair across from the desk. "Thank you for taking the time to come in. I know this is an added burden for a working mother." His tone was unexpectedly warm, and Sarah felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. "Thank you for meeting with me, Mr. Riley. I hope my request hasn't caused you any inconvenience." "Not at all. I wanted to meet you in person because your husband is an exemplary inmate, and I think it's important to support the families of inmates like him." Thomas leafed through Mark's file, even though he knew its contents by heart. "Tell me about your son. David will be 13 soon, right?" "Yes, next Saturday." Sarah smiled for the first time since entering the office. "He's a good boy, gets excellent grades, but it's not easy for him, you know. Kids at school can be cruel sometimes." Thomas nodded understandingly. "I can imagine. I don't have children myself, but I see how incarceration affects families. Tell me, how are you managing financially? I don't mean to pry, but there are assistance programs that many families don't know about." Sarah hesitated. Admitting financial difficulties had always been difficult for her, but there was something about Thomas's manner that inspired trust. "We're getting by. I work as a nurse at the hospital, but the rent, school expenses, visits here, it all adds up." "I understand. There's a fund for families of prisoners that can cover transportation costs for visits, and I'm thinking about expanding the family activities program, maybe picnics on prison grounds during the summer months." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That would be wonderful. David misses his father so much, and the regular visits are so short and formal." Thomas felt a warmth in his chest at her reaction. "Then consider it settled. I'll personally see to it that your request for an additional visit is approved, and we'll start working on the new programs." The meeting continued for another half hour. They discussed David's education, Sarah's work, and Thomas learned that she had studied psychology in college before switching to medicine. When Sarah finally got up to leave, Thomas felt reluctant to end the conversation. "Mrs. Velasquez, if you have any problems or questions, please don't hesitate to contact me directly. Here's my business card with my direct number." Sarah took the card, their fingers touching briefly. "Thank you, Mr. Riley. You are very kind. Mark will be happy to know that there are people who care about his family." After she left, Thomas sat in his office for a long time, staring at the door. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the room, as if Sarah's presence had left a trace in the air. He couldn't remember the last time he had been so interested in someone's story. That evening, Sarah told David about her meeting with the prison warden. The boy listened with wide eyes as his mother described the possible new programs for families. "So we'll be able to see Dad more often?" he asked hopefully. "Maybe, dear. Mr. Riley seems like a nice man who understands that families are important." Sarah stroked her son's hair, and he said there might be picnics where we can spend more time with Dad in the fresh air. That night, Sarah lay awake for a long time thinking about the meeting. Thomas Riley was not at all what she had imagined a prison warden to be. He was attentive, understanding, and she saw genuine concern in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, someone treated her not as the pitiful wife of an inmate, but as a person worthy of respect. Meanwhile, in prison, Mark was talking to Father Michael O'Connor during his evening rounds. "Sarah met with the warden today," Mark said, rereading his wife's letter. "She says he was very helpful with visits and promised new programs for families." Father Michael listened attentively. Over the years working in the prison, he had learned to read between the lines, and something in Mark's tone alarmed him. "That's good news. Mr. Riley really cares about the well-being of the inmates and their families." "Yes, but—" Mark paused, searching for the right words. "Don't you think it's strange that the warden would personally meet with families about such routine matters? Sarah writes that he even gave her his direct business card." The chaplain felt a slight unease. Perhaps he just wants to be more involved in family support programs, but it's important to remember that a healthy relationship with the administration can only help your situation. Mark nodded, but the alarm in his eyes did not disappear. 3 years in prison had taught him to be cautious and suspicious of unexpected kindness. The following week, Thomas found an excuse to contact Sarah again. He called her home in the evening, introducing himself as an official representative of the family assistance programs. "Good evening, Mrs. Velasquez. This is Thomas Riley from the prison. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Oh no, it's fine. Sarah was surprised by the call, but her voice betrayed her hidden pleasure. "How are things going with the programs we discussed?" "That's why I'm calling. I've received approval for extended family visits and I need to discuss the details. Perhaps we could meet somewhere neutral, say for coffee in town? I understand that the constant trips to the prison can be tiring." Sarah hesitated. Meeting with the warden outside of an official setting seemed unusual, but his suggestion was logical and thoughtful. "I think that would be convenient. There's a cafe on Main Street near the hospital where I work." "Great. Would 6 o'clock tomorrow evening work for you?" "After your shift." After the conversation, Sarah caught herself smiling for no apparent reason. She quickly suppressed the feeling, reminding herself that this was a business meeting, nothing more. The next evening, they met at a small cafe called Sunrise, which was popular with the locals. Thomas was already sitting at a corner table when Sarah entered. He stood up to greet her, and she noticed that he wasn't wearing a business suit, but a simple shirt and jeans, which made him seem more approachable and less formal. "Thank you for taking the time," he said, helping her sit down. "I ordered coffee, but if you'd prefer something else." "Coffee is fine, thank you." Sarah settled into her chair, feeling a little awkward in the informal setting. They started by discussing programs for families, but gradually the conversation turned to more personal topics. Thomas talked about his work in the prison system and how he came to the profession after studying criminology. Sarah shared her memories of medical school and how she met Mark. "He wasn't a bad person," she said, stirring her coffee. "Just circumstances, job loss, debt, desperation. I don't excuse what he did, but I understand how he got there." Thomas nodded understandingly. "I've seen a lot of stories like that. Good people who made one bad decision in a moment of crisis." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. She apologized and answered. "Hi, Mom Margaret. What? Oh no, I completely forgot the time. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up with a guilty look on her face. "I'm sorry. I have to pick up David from the neighbors. Time flew by." "Of course I understand." Thomas stood up with her. "Let me give you a ride. My car is parked right outside." On the way to Sarah's house, they continued talking, and Thomas learned more about her daily life, about the challenges of raising a teenager on her own, about her dreams and fears. When they pulled up to her house, he turned off the engine. "Sarah," he said, and she noticed that he had used her first name for the first time. "I want you to know that if you ever need help, not just with prison visits, but with anything, you can come to me." "Thank you, Thomas," she said, using his name too, and a strange tension hung between them. "You've been very kind to us." Their eyes met in the dim light of the car, and for a moment the air was filled with an unrecognizable energy. Then Sarah quickly opened the door. "Good night," she said, and hurried into the house. Thomas sat in the car for a few more minutes, watching the lights come on in the house. He knew he had crossed some invisible line, but he couldn't bring himself to regret it. For the first time in years, he felt alive. That same night, Father Michael O'Connor couldn't sleep in his small apartment near the prison. He had noticed changes in the warden's behavior, more frequent delays in the office, distraction during meetings, a new interest in programs for prisoners' families. As a man who had dedicated his life to understanding human nature, he sensed trouble brewing. 2 months had passed since their first meeting in the cafe, and what had started as professional concern had turned into regular correspondence and secret meetings. Every day, Thomas found new reasons to contact Sarah, to discuss visitation schedules, educational programs for David, or just to see how she was doing. Sarah, for her part, found herself eagerly awaiting his calls and messages. On Saturday morning, Thomas sat in his empty house, holding his phone. There was a message from Sarah on the screen. "David is playing baseball today at 3 o'clock. I wanted to thank you for helping with his equipment." A few weeks ago, he had learned that the boy didn't have money for a new glove and had anonymously donated the money through the school's assistance program. Without thinking, he typed a reply. "I'd love to see him play. Where's the field?" The reply came a few minutes later. "City Park, field number 2, but don't you think it's too much?" Thomas understood her concerns. A prison warden watching the son of an inmate play baseball could attract unwanted attention, but his desire to see Sarah and meet David was stronger than his caution. "I'll be careful, I just want to support a good kid." At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Thomas parked at the edge of the parking lot by the baseball field. He saw Sarah in the stands, standing out from the other parents with her natural beauty and dignity. She was wearing a simple white blouse and jeans, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, but to Thomas she looked more beautiful than any woman he had ever known. David turned out to be a skinny boy with his father's serious eyes, but his mother's smile. When he came up to bat in the 7th inning, Thomas felt a sudden surge of pride, as if he were watching his own son. After the game, which David's team won 8-6, Thomas approached Sarah. She introduced him to her son as Mr. Riley, who helps our family. "Nice to meet you, sir," David said, holding out his hand. "My mom says you work where my dad works." Thomas shook the boy's hand, feeling a lump in his throat. "Yes, and your dad is one of the best people there. He would have been proud of your game today." David's eyes lit up. "Really? Do you know my dad?" "Yes, I do. He reads a lot and helps other inmates with their letters. He's a very smart and kind man." Sarah watched the conversation with mixed feelings. Seeing Thomas interact with her son with such genuine concern was both touching and painful. It reminded her of what David was missing, male attention and guidance. "David, go get your things," she said gently. "We need to go home." When the boy ran back to the team bench, Thomas and Sarah were left alone. Other families were also gathering to leave, but they stood in their own bubble of silence. "Thank you for coming," Sarah said quietly. "It means a lot to him when someone cares." "I care about both of you," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Sarah, I need to tell you something." But before he could continue, David returned with his bag slung over his shoulder and a baseball glove in his hand. "Mr. Riley, will you come to my next game?" the boy asked hopefully. Thomas looked at Sarah, seeking permission in her eyes. She nodded almost imperceptibly. "Sure, if your mom doesn't mind." That night, after David went to bed, Sarah sat in the kitchen for a long time, trying to sort out her feelings. The last few months had been the most exciting of her life since Mark's arrest. Thomas had brought light and hope into her life that she hadn't felt in years. But every time she allowed herself to enjoy his company, guilt washed over her. She picked up the last letter from Mark and reread it. He wrote about his plans after his release, about how they would rebuild their family, about the job he hoped to find. Every word was filled with love for her and their son, and that made her relationship with Thomas even more painful. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Thomas's name appeared on the screen. "Hi," she answered, trying to keep her voice neutral. "Hi, did I wake you up? I know it's late, but I couldn't sleep." "No, I'm awake too." She moved into the living room, away from David's bedroom. "What are you thinking about?" "About today. About David. About you." His voice was soft, intimate. "Sarah, we need to talk honestly about what's going on between us." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. "Thomas, I know it's difficult. I know about your commitment to Mark. But I can't pretend anymore that I only have professional feelings for you." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the last barriers between them crumble. "I can't pretend either. But what can we do? The situation is impossible." "Maybe, but denying our feelings won't make them go away." They talked until 2 in the morning, sharing thoughts and feelings they had been holding back for months. By the end of the conversation, the line between friendship and something more had been completely erased. Meanwhile, in Folsom Prison, Mark couldn't shake his growing unease. Sarah's letters had changed. She wrote about new opportunities for the family, about Mr. Riley's kindness, about how good it was for David to have a male role model. Her words conveyed an enthusiasm that had been absent for years, but this both delighted and disturbed Mark. "Father O'Connor," he said to the chaplain during one of his visits, "may I ask you a personal question?" "Of course, my son." If you had a wife, and she had been alone for a very long time, would it be natural for her to seek the company of other men? Father Michael looked at Mark intently. "Are you worried about Sarah?" "I'm not worried. It's just that she often mentions the prison warden in her letters. She says how kind he is to her and David. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but I find that kind of attention strange." The chaplain paused, choosing his words carefully. He too had noticed the change in Thomas Riley's behavior. but didn't want to fuel suspicions without concrete evidence. Mark, isolation and loneliness are hard on all family members. If Sarah is offering support, it may just be human compassion, but if something is bothering you, it might be worth talking to her about it openly. In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Sarah's meetings became more frequent. They met in cafes in neighboring towns, went for walks in picturesque parts of the county, and with each meeting, their closeness deepened. Thomas showed Sarah places from his childhood and told her about his dreams and disappointments. Sarah shared memories of her life before marriage and her plans to become a psychologist, which had been dashed by the weight of family responsibilities. One evening, after a particularly long walk along the American River, they sat in Thomas's car watching the sunset. Sarah was talking about her fears for David's future when Thomas suddenly took her hand. "Sarah, I want to be part of your life, part of David's life. I know it's selfish, given the circumstances, but I can't hide my feelings anymore." She looked at their intertwined fingers, feeling a rush of emotions she had been trying to suppress for months. "Thomas, you don't have to say anything right now. Just know that I'm here, no matter what happens." When he drove her home that night, something happened between them that they had both been waiting for and dreading. At the doorstep, in the shadow of a large oak tree, they kissed. It was a tender, longing kiss between two people who understood the complexity of their situation, but could no longer deny their attraction to each other. After that evening, their relationship changed dramatically. They began seeing each other more often, their conversations became more intimate, and Sarah found herself thinking about Thomas constantly. Her guilt toward Mark didn't disappear, but it was pushed into the background by the power of her new feelings. Father Michael O'Connor was the first to notice the drastic changes in the prison warden's behavior. Thomas became distracted during administrative meetings, often lingered in his office for no apparent reason, and his usual professional strictness was replaced by an unusual gentleness in his interactions with staff. During one of his evening conversations with Mark, the chaplain decided to ask a direct question. "Mark, how are things with Sarah? She seems different in her latest letters." Mark looked up from the book he was reading. "Have you noticed that too? She writes that she's happy, that her life is back on track, but something's not right. Too many references to Mr. Riley, too much gratitude for his help. What do you think about that?" Mark was silent for a long time, then closed the book and looked straight at the chaplain. "I think my wife is falling in love with another man, and that man is the warden of the prison where I'm serving my sentence." The words hung in the air of the cell like a sentence. Father Michael felt a chill in his chest, realizing that his worst fears were beginning to materialize. "Mark, that's a serious accusation. Do you have any proof?" "Just intuition so far. But I've known her for 15 years. I know how she writes when she's happy, when she's sad, when she's hiding something. In her last letters, she's hiding something." That same week, Mark decided to investigate his suspicions. He asked another inmate who worked in the administrative building to observe the prison warden's behavior. A few days later, the information confirmed his fears. Thomas Riley often received personal phone calls, after which he became noticeably more cheerful, and several times left the prison at unusual times without official reasons. The final proof came in a letter that Sarah forgot to seal properly. In it, she mentioned our special friendship and thanked Thomas for bringing light into a dark time. Between the lines, there was an intimacy that could not be explained by professional concern alone. That night, Mark lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling of his cell. The pain of betrayal mixed with rage and a sense of helplessness. The man who controlled every aspect of his life in prison had stolen what was most precious to him. Justice seemed like a dead concept in a world where a prison warden could destroy a prisoner's family with impunity. At home, Thomas and Sarah spent the evening together for the first time. David was staying with Margaret, and they finally had a chance to be completely honest with each other. They cooked dinner together, talked about the future, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt like a complete woman, not just the mother and wife of a prisoner. "Sarah," Thomas said as they sat on the sofa after dinner, "I understand that our situation is complicated, but I want you to know that my feelings for you are real. This isn't a fling or a passing infatuation." "I know," she replied, leaning against his shoulder. "And that makes it even more complicated. Thomas, what will happen when Mark gets out of prison? What will happen to us? He stroked her hair, feeling the weight of the question. I don't know, but I know I can't just let you go and pretend nothing happened. They didn't know that their conversation had been overheard by little David, who had come home early and seen through the back window an unfamiliar man hugging his mother. The boy was too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that something in his world had changed dramatically and irreversibly. Mark Velasquez woke up in his cell long before the wake-up call. It was 5 in the morning, but he had been awake since 3, when he finally made the decision that had been maturing in his mind for the past 2 weeks. Outside the prison walls, a winter storm raged, and the wind howled through the ventilation shafts, as if nature itself sensed the impending tragedy. He pulled a folded piece of paper from under his mattress, a letter from a private investigator he had hired through his lawyer 3 weeks earlier. The detective had followed Sarah and Thomas and provided irrefutable evidence of their affair. Photos of them embracing outside Sarah's house, records of their dinners together at restaurants outside the city, and testimony from neighbors that Thomas regularly spent the night at the Velasquez home. The most painful was a photo taken last week. Thomas, Sarah, and David together at an amusement park, looking like a happy family. David was sitting on Thomas's shoulders, and Sarah was laughing, holding the hand of the man who had stolen her heart. For Mark, that image was worse than any physical pain. At 7 in the morning, Mark asked the guard for a meeting with the prison warden on urgent personal business. Such requests usually took weeks to process, but his exemplary behavior during his years in prison and his status as one of the most reliable inmates secured him an audience by 10 o'clock. Thomas Riley was sitting at his massive oak desk, reviewing the morning reports, when Dorothy announced Mark Velasquez's visit. He felt a slight uneasiness. In 3 years, their interactions had been limited to formal meetings within the prison hierarchy. "Send him in," Thomas said, putting down his papers. Mark entered the office accompanied by guard Jim Collins. He was wearing the standard orange prison uniform, his hands free, a privilege he had earned through years of good behavior. Thomas motioned for the guard to leave and closed the door. "Sit down, Velasquez," Thomas said, pointing to a chair across from the desk. "What brings you to me?" Mark sat down slowly, his dark eyes studying the face of the man who had destroyed his family. Thomas looked rested, content, with a slight smile on his lips, the smile of a man who has a secret source of happiness. "Mr. Riley, I want to thank you for taking care of my family," Mark began in a calm tone. "Sarah writes a lot about your kindness." Thomas felt a twinge of anxiety but kept his expression professional. "Family support programs are important for the rehabilitation of prisoners. Your wife and son deserve help." "Of course," Mark nodded, his voice remaining even. "Especially my son. David really needs a male role model. Sarah writes that you spend a lot of time with him. I sometimes participate in community events where inmates' families are present." Thomas began to feel the conversation was heading in a dangerous direction. Mark slowly took a folded photograph out of his uniform pocket and placed it on the table between them. It was a picture of Thomas and Sarah kissing at the entrance to their house on Oak Street. "Is this also part of the family support program?" Mark asked, his voice still calm, but a cold gleam appeared in his eyes. Thomas paled as he looked at the photo. His heart began to race, but he tried to maintain control of the situation. "Velasquez, I understand that you're upset, but..." "Upset?" Mark slowly rose from his chair. "Mr. Riley, you stole my wife. You stole my son. You took my place in my family while I rot in the cage you control." Thomas also stood up, instinctively taking a step back. "Mark, listen, this is a complicated situation. I never meant to hurt you." "Never meant to?" Mark's voice took on a note of anger for the first time. "You thought I'd never find out? That I'd just sit here like a obedient dog while you built a life with my family?" Mark began to slowly circle the table, his movements smooth, almost predatory. Thomas realized he had underestimated the prisoner's physical abilities. 3 years of prison training had made Mark stronger and more dangerous than he had been when he was arrested. "Velasquez, get back to your seat. We can discuss this civilly." "Civilized?" Mark laughed, but there was no joy in his laughter. "You talk about civility after using your position to seduce a prisoner's wife? After turning my son against his own father?" Thomas tried to reach the security call button on his desk, but Mark was quicker. He grabbed the warden's arm and threw him away from the table. "Don't call anyone," Mark hissed. "This is a conversation between men. Mark, think about the consequences. Think about what this will do to Sarah and David." At the mention of his family's names, something broke in Mark's eyes. All the pent-up rage, pain, and humiliation of the last few months burst forth. "Don't you dare mention their names!" He grabbed Thomas by the lapels of his jacket and pushed him toward the window. "You lost the right to talk about my family the moment you first laid a hand on my wife." Thomas tried to break free, but realized he was physically weaker. "Mark, I know you're angry, but murder won't solve your problems." "Murder?" Mark paused for a moment, as if realizing for the first time where the situation was leading. "I didn't plan to kill anyone. I just wanted to talk to the man who ruined my life." But when he saw the fear in Thomas's eyes, something dark and primal rose in his mind. It was the fear of a man who knew he deserved punishment. It was an admission of guilt. "You know you deserve this," Mark said quietly. "You know what you did was wrong on every level." Thomas tried to appeal to what remained of Mark's sanity. "Yes, I know. I know that Sarah and I did wrong. But by killing me, you'll only destroy what's left of your family." "My family is already destroyed," Mark replied with a bitter smile. "You took care of that." At that moment, footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mark realized that time was running out. He looked at the warden's desk and saw a heavy crystal paperweight, a gift from the city council in honor of Thomas's anniversary of service. "Mark, don't do it." Thomas saw where he was looking. "Think about David. You want him to grow up knowing that his father is a murderer?" "David is already growing up knowing that his father is a prisoner." Mark grabbed the paperweight. "Now he will know that his father defended the honor of his family." "Mark, please." The first blow struck Thomas in the temple. The sound was dull and terrifying. The warden collapsed to the floor, blood flowing from the wound on his head. Mark stood over him, holding the bloody paperweight, his breathing heavy and uneven. Thomas was still alive, his eyes open but clouded with pain and shock. He tried to say something, but only blood came out of his mouth. "You thought you could just take someone's life without consequences," Mark said, leaning over the defeated man. "You thought your position would protect you from justice." The second blow was more accurate and deadly. Thomas Riley, warden of Folsom State Prison, died in his office at 10:47 a.m., his blood soaking the Persian rug he had bought last year, dreaming of welcoming Sarah as his wife in that office. Mark dropped the blood-stained paperweight and sat down in the warden's chair. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from relief. For the first time in months, he felt that justice had prevailed, albeit in a terrible way. Footsteps in the hallway grew louder. Mark knew that in a few minutes the door would open, and his life would change forever. But he had no regrets. In a twisted way, he felt free for the first time since he had discovered Sarah's betrayal. The office door opened and guard Jim Collins entered, ready to escort Mark back to his cell after the meeting. "Mr. Riley, your meeting is ready." "Oh, God." Jim saw the body on the floor and Mark sitting in the chair with his hands covered in blood. The experienced guard instantly assessed the situation and reached for his radio. "Don't move, Velasquez. Hands on the table." Mark slowly put his hands on the table, making no attempt to resist. "I won't run, Officer Collins. I did what I had to do." Within minutes, the office was filled with guards, medics, and prison administrators. Mark was handcuffed and led away, but he walked calmly, with a strange look of peace on his face. The news of Thomas Riley's death spread through Folsom like wildfire. By noon, journalists had gathered at the prison gates, and Detective Jessica Cole had been assigned the most serious case of her career. Sarah learned of the tragedy from a call from Dorothy, who was sobbing and trying to explain what had happened. Sarah dropped the phone and collapsed on the kitchen floor, her world falling apart in a matter of seconds. "Mom, what happened?" David ran from his room, frightened by his mother's screams. Sarah couldn't speak. How could she explain to her son that the man he loved like a father was dead at the hands of his real father? How could she explain that their secret affair had led to murder? Father Michael O'Connor learned of the tragedy from the deputy warden. The chaplain immediately went to Mark, who was sitting in a solitary confinement cell, waiting for the detectives to arrive. "Mark," he said quietly, approaching the cell bars, "what have you done?" Mark raised his head and looked at the chaplain with eyes that showed no remorse. "I restored justice, Father. For the first time in years, I did something right. My son, murder is never right." "What about adultery? What about betrayal? What about using your power to destroy a family?" Mark stood up and approached the bars. "Riley got what he deserved. The only thing I regret is that I didn't do it sooner." Father Michael realized that he was looking at a man who had fully accepted his actions and their consequences. There was no madness in Mark's eyes, only a cold, calculated certainty that what he had done was right. By evening, Detective Jessica Cole had finished examining the crime scene and was preparing to question Mark Velasquez. The case seemed straightforward, a murder motivated by jealousy, with an obvious motive and plenty of evidence. But something about the suspect's calm demeanor and the reaction of the prison staff told her that there was more to the story than met the eye. Detective Jessica Cole arrived at Folsom State Prison 2 hours after the murder. At 29, she was the youngest detective in the department, but her reputation as a methodical and attentive investigator had earned her the assignment to this high-profile case. The crime scene was cordoned off, and Thomas Riley's office had been turned into the center of the most serious investigation in the county's history. "What do we have?" she asked Coroner David Chen, who was finishing his preliminary examination of the body. "Male, 42 years old, multiple blunt head injuries. The murder weapon is a crystal paperweight found next to the body with the suspect's fingerprints on it. Time of death is approximately 10:47 a.m. Jessica looked around the office, noting details. Blood spatters on the wall indicated the force of the blows, and an overturned chair suggested a struggle, but what caught her attention most was a photograph on the desk. A snapshot of Thomas and an unknown woman with a child at an amusement park. "Officer Collins," she said to the security guard who had first discovered the body, "tell me exactly what you saw." Jim Collins, a veteran prison guard with 20 years of experience, was still pale from the shock. "I accompanied Velasquez to his meeting with Mr. Riley at 10 o'clock this morning. It was a private meeting requested by the inmate. 45 minutes later, I returned to pick him up and found what you see." "What did Velasquez look like when you picked him up?" "Calm. Too calm for a man who had just committed murder. He sat in Mr. Riley's chair with blood on his hands and said he had done what he had to do." Jessica wrote down the words. The cold admission of guilt was unusual for a crime of passion. "Did Velasquez resist arrest?" "No, ma'am. He was completely subdued. It was as if he was waiting for us." The next step was to question Mark Velasquez. He sat in a solitary confinement cell, still in his blood-stained prison uniform, having refused an offer to change his clothes. When Jessica entered the interrogation room, she saw a middle-aged man with dark hair and piercing eyes that showed neither fear nor remorse. "Mr. Velasquez, I'm Detective Cole. I'd like to read you your rights." After the formalities, Jessica began the interrogation. "Tell me what happened in Mr. Riley's office this morning." Mark leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, almost defiant. "I killed the man who destroyed my family." "Explain that statement." "Thomas Riley had an affair with my wife, taking advantage of his position as prison warden. He betrayed my trust, abused his power, and destroyed my family while I was powerless to stop him." Jessica studied his face, looking for signs of deception or mental instability, but saw only cold conviction. "Do you have any evidence to support these allegations?" Mark took a folded envelope from his pocket. "A private investigator's report with photographs, dates, witness statements, everything you need to prove their relationship." The detective looked through the materials. The evidence was irrefutable. A series of photographs showing intimate moments between Thomas Riley and an attractive middle-aged woman whom Jessica recognized as the same woman in the photograph in the victim's office. "Mr. Velasquez, do you understand the seriousness of your actions? You killed a man." "I killed a man who deserved to die," Mark replied without hesitation. "Thomas Riley used his power to seduce a prisoner's wife. He turned my son against me. He got what he deserved." "What he deserved? You're not a judge or a jury, Mr. Velasquez." Mark showed emotion for the first time, his eyes flashing with anger. A judge? Who was the judge when Riley decided to destroy my family? Where was justice when he abused his position? Jessica spent 3 hours with Mark, but his story didn't change a single detail. He had planned the meeting to confront Riley, but insisted that the murder was a spontaneous decision made in a moment of rage. The next task was to meet with Sarah Velasquez. Jessica found her at her home on Oak Street, where the woman sat in her kitchen surrounded by neighbors and friends trying to comfort her. Sarah looked devastated, her eyes red from crying, her hands shaking as she tried to hold a cup of tea. "Mrs. Velasquez, I'm Detective Cole. I need to ask you a few questions about your relationship with Mr. Riley." Sarah raised her head, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and fear. "I don't know what to say. It's all my fault." "Why do you think that?" If we hadn't. Sarah couldn't finish her sentence, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Tom is dead because of me, because of our relationship." Jessica asked the neighbors to leave and remained alone with Sarah. "Tell me about your relationship with Thomas Riley." The story Sarah told matched the detective's evidence. She described how their professional relationship had grown into friendship and then love. She didn't try to justify her actions, but explained the loneliness and despair that had led to the affair. "We knew we were doing wrong," she said through her tears, "but I hadn't felt alive in years. Tom gave me hope. He cared for David like his own son." "Mrs. Velasquez, did you know that your husband suspected your relationship?" Sarah shook her head. "I thought we were being careful. Tom always said we had to be careful because of his position." "Where is your son now?" "He's with my neighbor Margaret. I don't know how to explain it all to him. How do you tell a 12-year-old boy that his father killed a man he loved?" Jessica understood the complexity of the situation. David had become an unwitting victim of adult decisions, and now he would have to live with the consequences of the tragedy. The next day, Jessica met with Father Michael O'Connor in his small office at the prison. The chaplain was one of the few people who knew everyone involved in the tragedy well. Father O'Connor, looking back, were there any signs that Mark was planning something like this? The elderly priest was silent for a long time, choosing his words carefully. "Detective Cole, Mark had changed in recent months. He had become more withdrawn, suspicious, but I never thought he was capable of murder." "And Mr. Riley? Did you notice any changes in his behavior?" Thomas had become distracted, happier, but less focused on his work. "Now I understand why." Father Michael sighed. "I sensed something was brewing, but I didn't know how to prevent it." "Do you think Mark planned the murder in advance?" "No. Mark is not a murderer by nature. It was an act of desperation and rage by a man who had lost everything he held dear." The investigation continued for 2 weeks. Jessica gathered statements from prison staff, Sarah's neighbors, David's teachers, and anyone else who could shed light on the relationships between those involved in the tragedy. The picture became clearer. It was a story of betrayal, loneliness, and the tragic consequences of forbidden love. District Attorney Robert Hansen decided to charge Mark with first-degree murder, despite the defense's arguments that it was a crime of passion. The evidence showed that Mark had hired a detective to gather evidence, which pointed to premeditation. The trial began 6 months later and became a sensation in the local and national media. The story of a prison love triangle that ended in murder captured the attention of the entire country. Mark's lawyer, the experienced Michael Stone, built his defense on temporary insanity and emotional distress. Sarah was a key witness for both the prosecution and the defense. Her testimony was painful for everyone present. She spoke honestly about her relationship with Thomas, how loneliness had led her to infidelity, and how their love had become the cause of the tragedy. "I'm not trying to justify what my husband did," she said in her testimony, "but I understand his pain. I caused him suffering that led to this terrible tragedy." David was not present at the trial, but his psychological state was the subject of an expert examination. The boy suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and could not understand why the 2 men he loved had ended up in such a situation. Michael's father's testimony was particularly important. He spoke about Mark's psychological state in the months leading up to the murder, confirming that the prisoner had been suffering from depression and growing paranoia about his family. Mark was a broken man, the chaplain said. Imprisonment had already caused him immense pain, and the discovery of his wife's infidelity was the last straw. Expert psychiatrists presented conflicting conclusions. The defense expert argued that Mark was suffering from temporary insanity at the time of the murder, caused by extreme emotional stress. The prosecution expert insisted that hiring a detective proved premeditation and the ability to think rationally. The jury deliberated for 3 days. In the end, they returned a verdict of guilty of second-degree murder, striking a compromise between a full acquittal and a first-degree murder conviction. The judge sentenced Mark to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. After the sentencing, Sarah moved with David to another state, trying to start a new life away from the tragic memories. The house on Oak Street was sold, and the proceeds went toward David's psychological care and legal expenses. Father Michael continued to visit Mark in the maximum security prison where he was transferred after sentencing. The prisoner never expressed remorse for killing Thomas, but deeply regretted the pain he had caused his son. David paid the highest price for the mistakes of adults, he told the chaplain during one of his visits. He lost his father, he lost the man he considered his second father, and now he has to live with that burden. Detective Jessica Cole closed the case, but it left a deep mark on her mind. She often wondered if the tragedy could have been prevented if someone had intervened earlier, if Thomas and Sarah had been more careful, if Mark had sought help instead of revenge. A year after the tragedy, a new position was created at Folsom Prison, ethics consultant, whose job was to prevent conflicts of interest among staff. The new rules prohibited personal relationships between prison staff and inmates' families. Sarah wrote a letter to Mark 2 years after the trial, but he returned it unopened. He did not want to have any contact with her, believing that their story had ended the moment the paperweight fell in Thomas Riley's office. David grew up trying to cope with the trauma of his childhood. At school, he was known as the murderer's son, and this label followed him even after he moved away. But gradually, with the help of psychologists and his mother's support, he began to recover. The small town of Folsom also changed. The prison scandal undermined trust in the local authorities, but over time, life returned to normal. The new prison warden, a strict 50-year-old woman, introduced strict rules of ethical conduct to prevent a repeat of the tragedy. The story of Thomas Riley, Sarah, and Mark Velasquez served as a warning about how forbidden love can destroy not only the lives of those involved, but also everyone around them. It was a story about how justice sometimes takes ugly forms, and that the price of passion can be too high for everyone involved. In a maximum security prison, Mark spent his days reading books and reflecting on his choices. He did not regret killing Thomas. In his mind, it was an act of justice. But every night he was tormented by thoughts of his son growing up without a father, and how a moment of rage had determined the fate of so many people. Justice had prevailed, but at what cost? It was a question with no easy answer in a story where there were no innocents, only victims of circumstance and their own decisions.